I think that this particular last episode, we kind of broad brush covered the entire framework that the Imperfect Men's Club operates under, right? There's a wheel, there's a circle, and in the center of the circle, there's the self, and all of the hyphens, self hyphen, so awareness, accountability. That there's a million of them. We play with three main ones, right? We play with self awareness, and then that leads to self-evaluation, and then that leads to self-accountability, and then you can go to your heart's desire with additional self hyphen words. But for now, and then the self is surrounded by the major areas of one's life, and we identified those in no particular order as things like relationships, money, health, worldview, and career. And, we could have named 7, we could have named 10, we could have stopped at 3. But those 5, what we found over the years that we've talked about this, and when we reflect back on maybe the first conversation a few years ago, we find that we were actually practicing something that you brought to my attention, radiant thinking. And if I can, Jim, let me just read this little blurb that I found on the internet about what radiant thinking is. And that self in the center and the circle around it starts to make really good sense.
Yeah.
So.
And yeah, before you do that also, yeah, I think I mentioned, I discovered this in recent years, as a dyslexic, and I mean, not mild dyslexia, severe dyslexia and dysgraphia. I had to do kind of a soul search myself, like a self-evaluation about how my brain functioned differently than others. And I came across this mind mapping software, and this author of this materials about how the brain, how all brains function, but specifically dyslexics. So yeah, that's where this comes from. So yeah,
it's fascinating, because it seems to me, because you and I came up with this wheel concept, right? And I don't remember exactly how it started, but it came to fruition pretty quick, because there were a couple of epiphanies, as I recall.
Well, I drew it up in the software.
This makes
the radio sense. Software. So that's where it came from. And I learned the concepts for going through this course. There was a course that I took but go ahead and I'd like to hear.
I'm going to read this blurb. I think it'll clarify for anybody who's never heard this term before in the context of the wheel I just described, our wheel, the Imperfect Men's Club wheel. Radiant thinking usually begins with the central concept or problem at the center, and various ideas and solutions radiating out from that point. Each new point becomes the center of its own radiant thoughts, eventually generating branch after branch of diverse thought. One advantage to radiant thinking is that it can incorporate all thoughts, even those that do not directly relate to the central problem. And so, it's funny, Jim, when I think about the conversations we've had, it's all been radiant thinking. It's all, and it's all in our particular case, which is what we're going to talk about today in this series of 7 episodes moving forward, are the 7 areas that are involved in our framework. The first, as I've said, being the self at the center of the circle. And then we talk about this idea of agency, which is, the notion that people go through life and they run into kind of transformative moments. And in those moments, it's nice to have somebody on your shoulder that's objectively helping you through these tough decisions, which is at the core of what we do here at the Imperfect Men's Club. And I just think today we're going to expand on that center of self, and then we'll tackle each of the 5 concentric areas around the circle. And then maybe we'll end up talking in the 7th episode, 7 weeks from now, about the whole idea of agency and why it makes sense for almost all of us. As we were talking about beforehand, I don't know if this is an accurate statement. I have no scientific evidence that it is, but my gut tells me it's true. Most people don't go through any formal self-awareness exercise in their life. And those that do, kind of, maybe it's brought upon them by some sort of external hardship or tragedy, like someone dies or they lose all their money or somebody gets sick, because those types of events push you into self-awareness. But what we're talking about, at least correct me if I'm wrong, is the concept of being self-aware as a habit, being self-aware as a daily practice, being self-aware as this is an ongoing journey of self-awareness. I don't know when it began, doesn't matter, but I know it's never going to stop, because when I reflect and be honest with myself, and you can share your views on this, Jim, I wish you would, is not always an easy thing to do, because quite oftentimes you discover something about yourself that you don't like. And that's probably one of the reasons most people don't do it. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's one of the reasons we named the podcast the Imperfect Men's Club, because the more we learn about ourselves, the more we realize we're not perfect. I think we all strive for perfection, but when that doesn't happen, it can lead to some bad things in our lives. So, yeah, the imperfection is the perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And once you accept that, then I think life gets easier, because we're self-defeating. There's our self-worth. That's all starts with ourself. Right?
Yep.
It's not what happens to us in life. It's how we respond to what happens to us. And
I think the other kind of related things for me are the personal accountability issue or self accountability issue. I think it's just without that, none of this other stuff works. I mean, if you're not willing to say, this is my shit and I'm the only person who can get me out of this or make progress in this or fix this or make this look different or make this feel different, there are going to be outside influences in this kind of circle of life thing. But at the end of the day, the work that you do on yourself is where all the happiness is. That's where all the results come from. The external stuff is sometimes helpful, sometimes it's a hindrance, but it's the internal work is where the juice is, as they say.
Well, it's the foundation that you have to build off of, right?
Yep.
If you have a weak foundation, then I don't care what work you're doing to try to improve yourself or the life of yourself and others around you. If you don't have a solid foundation, which starts with yourself, then you're building it on it'll collapse eventually. But I think the other one that the self comes into, again, we have our first, right? Self awareness, self evaluation, and so on. But it also becomes very personal. It can be personalized. That self can keep going and going, where it is personalized for each individual at different stages of their life as well. But at the end, it is about self alignment. So the radial thinking is alignment. We want to be in alignment with other parts, all these 5 areas of our life.
Yeah, we talk about it a lot, and just for an example, you pick one of them, your health, or well-being, whatever word you want to use, and is there really? Can you think of? And I'm asking this rhetorically, but I'd also like your answer. If something is going really poorly with your emotional health, how could that not affect your relationships, your view of money, your profession, and even potentially your worldview? And those are the categories. So it's like this radiant thinking idea is that, these aren't, we don't, what's the word? Not literally, laterally, in order. What's the phrase for in order?
Linear?
One after the other. No, I think linear thinking. Sorry.
Yes, linear.
These are not one thing leads to the next in this particular order. These are pinging all over the place, right?
Right. Yeah.
And if you're if you're not enjoying what you're doing for work, for instance, that's you got to bring that inside and ask. And obviously that's what I did for a living for a long time. But you got to bring that inside and say why. Why?
So
why
it's also how the brain functions.
Yeah.
The brain is shooting off thoughts, neurons, at all different places, all different times. Again, not as in a logical way. So, these concepts are not just made up for this course or for explanations. It's really the way the brain functions. In fact, think of the middle of your of that circle as the top of your head, and as the brain waves shoot out thoughts, that's what's happening. And the more you're aware of that, the more you can, I guess, guide that to create structure and some understanding of why you're thinking that, and how everything is related, how eventually it all ties together, and one thing does affect another thing.
And we in some of the work that I do, and you're familiar with it, call it what you will, spiritual work, mindfulness. To me, prayer and meditation are the same thing. It's a form of self-awareness, right? It's a form of self-evaluation. But when your mind starts thinking like this, and you're like in a moment, you're like in a meditation, you're on a call, you're in a conversation, you're in a moment of some kind. And it's really interesting to be able to start the process of like, all right, well, who am I talking to? What should my tone be like?
Mhm.
What am I trying to accomplish? Right. Then all of a sudden there's all these other kind of radiant thoughts that, just to your point,
Mhm.
start pinging all over the place. And people talk about things in the professional scene about leadership, like empathetic listening. Well, empathetic listening is you being self-aware of the fact that before I can help this person, I got to know what's going on. So shut up and listen, you
Mhm.
know? And then it'd probably be nice to have some context as well. Like, how you doing? How is life throwing you donuts or hand grenades? Tell me what's going on. And I think that it just everything, if you're serving other people, if you're trying to help other people in any capacity at all, you really have to begin that engagement with empathy. And empathy comes from self-awareness, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, you can't get around this stuff. You
Yeah.
can you
Yeah.
can deny it, and you can try and avoid it, but you can't get around it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned meditation, because without going into a full meditation conversation, what is it? It's slowing the mind down, so it's is as much in the presence as it can be. So it's not jumping forward and it's not jumping back. It's
Mm-hmm.
living in the moment. At that point, when the breathing and the mind relaxes, it can create alignment and it creates structure. And then at that point, you have self-control. You're much more in control of your thoughts than
Mm-hmm.
had you not taken the time to slow yourself down a little bit. And that's often what you see, right? If somebody's completely out of control, they're projecting their fear on you, either from what happened in the past or what could happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm. I
yeah.
remember, Jim, I used to tell the salespeople and the recruiters that worked for me at the beginning of their time with me, when they would bring something to my attention that somebody was rude to them, for instance. So like a sales guy, I fucking hate recruiters. What are you calling me for? Where'd you get my name? But it just like immediately rude. And I say, you have to stop that conversation, right? Because that person's not in self-control. And
Mhm.
that I would almost bet money 90% of the time that person is projecting on you, that has something that has nothing to do with you. Their wife
Mhm.
just left them, or somebody just died, or they
Mhm.
got cut off in traffic on the way into it. It has nothing to do with you. And I
Mhm.
remember I used to say to them, you need to stop that person, say, excuse me, if I may, I need to ask you, what have I done to earn the level of disrespect that you're giving me right now? I'd like you to help me with that, because I don't know what I've done that why you're being so rude to me. Every single one of them would say to me, you want me to say that? And I'm like, yes, I want you to say that, because one of two things is going to happen, right? The guy's going to really be an asshole, and you discovered it early, and so you're not wasting any time with an asshole, or you're going to get some form of an apology because you just triggered the self-awareness that they're projecting something of theirs on you, and you didn't do anything wrong. And I don't know why that popped into my head, but that was a really powerful technique, that when people got that down, some of those, when you turn somebody around that's being rude to you, those relationships can be some of the best ones you ever have, but
Yeah,
all
no
kinds of.
question. And that's what everybody really is seeking, right? For somebody that has some order or some structure, and that they'll hang on to that. He's much more believable.
Mhm.
Maybe you may disagree with him, but you respect him or her, um, that has done some self-alignment before the meeting and has some structure and some certainty in what it is that trying to convey, or
Do,
whatever
do
the
you, do
situation
you,
is in.
this might be a bit of an ambush, but I can apologize after the fact. Do you remember, um, were you self-aware from the time you became a sentient being, or did it happen to you at some point in your life based on something that happened to you? Do you remember?
I do. I remember my mind has always uh, operated this way. I remember my mind is no different. I can remember moments when I was 5 years old versus even 10 years old that are exactly like they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I like when I was struggling with bringing, I'm an inventor, right? So I'm bringing things to life that nobody else can see at this point.
Mm-hmm.
That's exciting. It's fun. It's also very, very difficult because it's millions and millions of failures in order to actually bring it to life, so
Mm-hmm.
especially to commercialize it and make money, or change something. Um, so it was hard, especially in school, to be educated not to think to think a certain way that was completely different the way that my mind naturally was processing information. So then as things become more complicated and a lot more information as you get older in life, and you're trying to do more ambitious things, more complicated things, especially some of the projects I'm doing now with artificial intelligence and computer vision, machine learning. It's very difficult to convey all those thoughts to somebody. But to be an
Mm-hmm.
effective in anything, you have to have the ability to communicate your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that that my mind, the dyslexic mind, thinks in concepts. So that's different, right? Thinking in concepts, that's very not. I can see big picture very fast, and alignment comes very, very natural and very fast to me. But not everybody else does. So you can lose people, and yeah. But again, I think as time goes on, especially with technology, we have this. It's an amazing time to think about these abilities to communicate in other ways other than the written word.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
graphics, there's the audio word. I mean, the what we're doing right now, audio, right? There's all these other things, and that's what the world ahead of us is going to be. It's not going to be limited to just reading a book and writing a report.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What you're describing though, or what I'm hearing is two things. One is, yeah, you literally see the world differently than I do, like literally. And
Yes.
most of it seems to me to be your brain's processing far more images than mine is at any given moment, like hundreds
Yeah.
of times more.
Yeah, that's
And
exactly what if you were to Google the definition of the dyslexic mind, that's exactly what it would come back, and it's proven. I think the average mind processes, I'm totally guessing, but average mind process 300 images per second. Dyslexic mind, does 1,200
yeah,
images per second. So, and
yeah,
it's
I don't think most of us could even fathom what that means. I
yeah,
mean, I get it conceptually, but the other thing it makes clear to me is that it doesn't matter who you're talking to. It doesn't matter whether you're on a job hunt or negotiating a raise or talking to a potential client or your wife or your kid. I think it behooves us all to, and I know we don't do this. I know I don't do it every time. I'm usually not self-aware until the self-aware switch goes off, which is usually after the fact when I've said something like, you shouldn't have said that in the context of this conversation. But it is a real easy reminder that the first thing you got to do right before you engage somebody is go, what do I know about this person? What do I know about this situation? And if the answer is not much, that's the whole conversation for the first few minutes, because just like you're coming from a completely different place than I am by nature of the way your brain works, we're all coming at things differently, emotionally, physically, spiritually, contextually. It's all like, am I talking to my daughter or am I talking to my son? Those are two different conversations, right? If this is a sales product, I mean, when's the first time you came
yeah.
home and your wife said, don't try and close me?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think, I'm glad you mentioned a couple things that are important. Yeah. Women definitely think differently than men. Again, and not one is better than the other. We need each other. So
Yep.
I don't ever want to frame this as we're speaking from a place of superiority or a place of that this way is better than the other. If anything, as you get older, you realize how you need the world needs everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a combination. That's why, I appreciate working with you. You help. If we were exactly the same, we wouldn't need each other. This
Right.
podcast would be kind of boring, wouldn't it? Right.
Yep.
So
Yep.
having these different perspectives is what makes, that's the magic of things. So
yeah, I mean, we just had we had a conversation just before this podcast that was, it took me, I don't know, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to kind of go, oh, I wasn't coming from there. You're coming from a completely different place than I am. And it was like, to your point, we think differently. We, I lean on writing and reading way more than you do, and you're far more appreciative of audio and video than I am. And like you said, it's not right or wrong. It's like, I think perhaps I'm using my gifts wisely and you're using your gifts wisely.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you saying that, because it's, and again, I really value that I remember specifically, before we started the call, that I was going to start our conversation this morning about establishing, remember, this conceptual, bigger picture thinking about how we can utilize this Chat GPT, particularly Chat GPT 4, and how that's a tool, and that what we're doing is more valuable, more important than ever before. But we have these tools, we have access to these tools now. And now I think about it, I was thinking very conceptually and trying to establish that, but I really appreciate you coming back and say, I didn't get that at first. This doesn't mean that I was wrong or you didn't get it, but I really value that you came back around and go, okay, now I think. I said, yeah, I remember in the beginning of the conversation, I was trying to, and you go, I do remember that, but now I have a little more appreciation for, I think, what you were trying to say. That's called a relationship of trust that we built over, years, that we have, that not everybody has that, right? It wasn't an argument. It was like, oh, okay, Jim, I get you. I know you enough, and now now, here we are. And I think it was a very productive conversation, not a conflict.
What I appreciated about it from my own perspective is that my mind just went to self-awareness. My mind, what is this? What are you talking about? And I don't mean it like that literally. I mean, like, I got this sense that you're coming from a different place than I am, and I just got some sense of that. Let me investigate that a little further. Oh, I see. Yeah. This is self-awareness. This is exactly what we started talking about. And I think in the work that I've done over the last few years, in my whole life, trying to be self-aware, how can I get better? How can I do more? How can things, just improve? Is I remember the first time, I told you this story once before. I told my father I was really struggling, questioning my faith. And I thought he was going to get mad at me because he's so religious or spiritual or both. And he said, oh, no, question everything, Mark, question everything. And that's kind of where I go back to being self-aware. It's like, oh, I get to do that. No, you don't just get to do that. To be happy in life and successful in life, you have to do that, right? Yeah. Life is a constant reassessment of your own self-awareness. Yeah. And that's why it's so cool that we begin with that in what's going to become the course and all of the rest of the content that we produce around the Imperfect Men's Club.
Yeah. Yeah. You just made me remind me of something too. And my daughter was in town recently, and we had some conversations you don't normally have unless you're in person, right? And some emotional conversations about her childhood and me when she was at that age. And I first of all, I valued her for, bringing this up to talk about it, because you don't have an opportunity always to give her an explanation of, who I was at that time and how we do change. Right. But I do think when you mentioned religion, that it's a time, it's just back to your worldview, there's a lot of connections to that, but we did grow up in a right or wrong. In order for me to be right, you have to be wrong. And I don't think that's 100% productive as we get older, right? You can, but I do think that's that also comes from our faith. There's certain religions, that you grow up being told you're right, I'm wrong, this is right, wrong, right, wrong, right, wrong. Even as a child, don't do that.
Yeah.
No, and punishment, you know,
Yeah.
and then judgment. Over time, they build up.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I'm making sense, but I do think that you get to a certain point where you can have a conversation without having to be right. You're not trying to be right. You're
No
trying to
question.
convey a thought, a message, a feeling, and it shouldn't have to be a winner and a loser and a right and a wrong.
Yeah, no,
So
it's a great point, Jim. I think that, and the other things that come to mind, I'm going to go pretty personal here for a sec, but before I do that, I think the need to convince someone about what you believe in or change someone's mind or be right, yeah, that diminishes over time because you learn, I guess, or you don't. That's not a very effective strategy, you know. And I mean, there are certain times when it comes into play, and you know, if you're in a position of leadership and you have authority and you need to demand something of someone, and so on and so forth. But really, even then, bringing some empathy to that conversation so that you understand where the other person's coming from. You know, one of the things that's astonishing to me, this is the personal stuff, and I've told you this. My son was wrestling with drugs for a long time, and got really close to, you know, leaving this earth. And more recently, he had a collapsed lung that came at least in part as a result of some of the stuff he was smoking and vaping and stuff like that. So he decided on his own, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And we came
that's
home from
great.
the we came home from the hospital, and he immediately went to his room, and anything in the category of paraphernalia, and it was pretty substantial. There were 4 or 5 pieces of whatever it was, threw it right in the trash. Didn't ask me, didn't say, what do you think? Just threw it in the trash. He hasn't smoked anything, and it was weed and you know, THC stuff. Now in 2 months,
That's
and
great.
you talk about a self-awareness blossom.
Hmm.
This guy's bumping into life sober and seeing things for the first time at the age of 26 that people normally see when they're 14 or 15 years old. And I got to knock on wood that I don't jinx the whole thing, but everything about his life, the more self-aware he becomes, the more confident he becomes, the more he flourishes, the more responsible he becomes, the more personally accountable he becomes. I'm not even I'm not even massaging this evolution, Jim. I'm just watching it happen, and it's the perfect time to share
Yeah,
it
no, I
because
appreciate you sharing it. And like you said, there's so much. It's self love, right?
yep,
His self worth, his self confidence, all that came from that decision. And hey, I'm not going to let this bring me down. So,
it started with a little anxiety
mhm.
and a little fear. But as I stayed with them, and I think honestly, Jim, I think this is the kind of thing that we can bring to our clients at the Imperfect Men's Club, is that if we can generate and speed up and fuel this self-awareness engine, all kinds of magical things start to happen. And then over
Yeah.
time, with reinforcement and this idea of radiant thinking, now let's get out into the world now. What about your health? What about your worldview? What about relationships, money, and your career? Now let's start going granular with this self-awareness engine
Mhm.
and see how we can change the whole fucking world, you know?
Yeah, and the other thing that we've been deliberate in adding is also agency, right? And agency um, is a nice way in the end to pull it all together, because it does require your son took agency on himself to make that decision, right?
Well,
But
he
sometimes you need people around you in order to guide you. And I know you've obviously been, you know, a huge part of his life, and he's
well,
fortunate to have you there.
he's got a and to your point earlier, I found myself like, I'm not going to tell him what to do. I'm just going to give him my opinion when he asks for it. And we had a conversation yesterday about his new job and the sales conversation that he was supposed to be having and how it was to be conducted. And he said something like, I told my boss, you know, my dad's a badass at sales. I got to go talk to him about this because we're not doing something right. And he shared with me what they were doing. And I said, well, why wouldn't you try something like this? And he's like, I knew it. I knew it. Say that again. I want to write that down. I knew I should have asked you earlier. And so I was being his agent, but I wasn't the emotionally unobjective father.
Yeah,
I
that's a
backed
difference.
off. I backed off and I said, he's asking me for my professional wisdom. That's a
Mhm.
different conversation. And he's asking me. There's a lot going on in that there. I didn't,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, no, I
fascinating.
appreciate the sharing the story. And I wanted to share a quote that everything good comes from something bad. And that reminded me of that story, right? He was in the hospital. He clearly hit a point in his life what was bad, but look at the good that comes from it. And it
Mhm.
is a decision, right? It's a decision that he made. And it was after, the things we're talking about today, right? So
Yeah, I just,
self-awareness,
yeah,
a serious self-evaluation while he was in that hospital bed.
totally. I was
Yeah.
with him the whole time, and that's all that was happening was self-evaluation
Yeah.
and self-awareness
Yeah.
getting boosted. But yeah, it's and he's got his sisters are great agents for him as well.
Hmm.
And they operate they support him a little bit differently than I do, but it's equally as valuable. And it's just I think one of the things that, got us into this work and will keep us in this work is that there's so many people out there that with just a little bit of a nudge, just to hear it from somebody that is, and I'll give us both credit for being moderately intelligent, pretty experienced, and pretty self-aware. And then we have our respective specific professional talents, some of which are similar and some of which are not. And that we can, if we can bring that to people that are just struggling with that alone, I don't know who I am, I'm not sure why I'm here, I'm not sure what I'm doing. That's a self-awareness conversation. And once that conversation can be had, like back and forth, like really going deep, um now I can see immediately, and I just got goosebumps about all. Now I can reflect out radiantly at all these other 5 areas and take them on one at a time, and then
Hmm.
take them on collectively because they're all so closely related. And then add to that formula the notion of agency. We're going to also be that objective third party that'll be honest with you, that'll be candid with you, that'll be supportive of you, will probably help you get out of your own way, will probably be able to improve your confidence level because the reason you're not confident are pretty evident and they can be dealt with, and just on and on and on. And then people can live the rest of their lives with a lot more control over their happiness and their future.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah.
cool.
It is cool. And we're gonna wrap this up. And I have a question for you, a couple of yourselves, because I think you can personalize this conversation about self, right?
Uh-huh.
But I've also grown to appreciate people that can laugh at themselves. I think that's one of the nicest uh, personality traits, when somebody can get to a place where they're self-confident enough, they're self-aware enough, they've done enough of self-evaluation where they can laugh at themselves.
Oh
And
yeah. Oh yeah.
and I think that if you strive to get to a point where you can laugh at yourself, um, that's a great place to be. So that's and then
Well, oh, do you
yeah.
have a second thought?
No, go ahead. You could come in on that. I want your thoughts, and then I have one final question. We'll wrap this one up. But
I was thinking about your conversation with your daughter in
yeah.
regard to what you just said, and I find myself, and I'm sure you do too. I'm all dads at our age probably do. Is my children? This started happening years ago because they're in their 20s and 30s right now, but in their late teens, early 20s,
Mhm.
they start calling you out on your shit,
Oh yeah.
and they start using phrases that you used on them back on you, right?
Yeah.
And that's how can you not laugh at yourself when you find yourself in that situation? I do it all the time, and
Yeah.
they are looking for opportunities to get me like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to share that when it was
Yeah,
on my
again, we could
mind.
do a whole episode of talking, but for the one thing that the takeaway from this conversation with my daughter was, to let her know I'm human too, and that, yeah, at that time she was growing up, I was who I was, but doesn't mean I haven't changed or I haven't become. It's not that I have changed. I've become more self-aware of some of these things and
Mhm.
how maybe they weren't serving me so well, and that,
Yeah.
but I
Yep.
was just doing the best I could at that time,
Yep.
and and humanizing her father, because that, I think we have a tendency not to do that just because it's our father, that they're not human, or they don't have feelings, or they don't make
Oh yeah.
mistakes.
Oh yeah.
And back, and we've used this word too, humility, right? It requires you to have some humility in order to be able to relate or get to that point. But that's yeah. But if I was to ask you, and then I'll go after you, what are your selves? Like, if you were to use one self to live by, or I know you start off with 3 that we use for the program. What are your selves? And again, no wrong answer. They change all the time. But what would be your first self hyphen blank?
Yeah, I it's just becoming my favorite word. It's authenticity, self authenticity. I think it's it doesn't necessarily serve me grammatically. I don't know if that's actually a phrase, but
you strive for that. That's something that
I find so much benefit to being authentic. I find it feels so good to be authentic. And and it's kind of like lying. I was never a liar because I never wanted the burden of having to remember what I said. And when you're authentic, you don't have to remember.
Yeah.
You were just being who you were. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what popped into my head.
Yeah. The one I think the most important is self-worth is really, really important. You have to work on that one. Self-love, that's a hard one. It's hard to love yourself. I
didn't name those because I'm not good at those.
That's called self-awareness. that requires some self-evaluation that then would lead to some self-alignment. So yeah, that's a great way to wrap that one up.
Yeah, let's wrap it up by just saying that this is the beginning of this 7 episode series. We're going to do the podcast around the wheel that we've used. So the next one we'll pick one of the 5 categories, but this was all about self-awareness, and we'll get to agency in this series as well. But I enjoyed this one, Jim.